The most terrifying sound in the world is no longer a scream, it is the absolute absence of silence in a forest that refuses to rest. We used to rely on the rhythm of the sun, the gentle grace of the dusk that signaled a truce between the hunter and the hunted. But that truce has been violently revoked. Imagine a world where the concept of night has been erased, replaced by a relentless, twitching energy that consumes everything in its path. There is no more sanctuary in the shadows, for the creatures that once hid there are now driven by a biological engine that has lost its brakes. They are wide awake, they are starving, and they are never going to close their eyes again. It began with the birds. People noticed the songbirds didn't stop at sunset. Their melodies became jagged, frantic, and increasingly shrill as the hours of darkness passed. Then the livestock followed. Cattle began to pace their pens until their hooves bled, their eyes wide and bloodshot, reflecting the moonlight with an intensity that seemed unnatural. It wasn't a disease in the traditional sense, but a fundamental shift in the genetic clock. A mutation had stripped away the necessity of sleep, but it hadn't removed the metabolic cost of being alive. To stay awake forever, a body needs fuel 10 times more than a body that rests. The hunger that followed was not a choice, it was a desperate, biological mandate. We are living through the era of the sleepless tide. The natural world has become a high-speed engine of consumption, tearing through the food chain at a velocity that defies logic. When an animal no longer sleeps, its muscles never repair, its mind never settles, and its stomach is never full. The predators are the worst. A wolf that does not sleep is a wolf that must kill every hour just to keep its heart beating. The forests, once places of balanced ecosystems, have become slaughterhouses where the sounds of snapping bone and tearing flesh ring out 24 hours a day. There is no peace to be found under the canopy, only the constant, rhythmic grinding of teeth. The visual landscape of our world has changed. If you look out into the woods behind your house at 3 in the morning, you won't see the stillness of the trees. You will see hundreds of tiny, glowing red embers. These are not fires, but the tapetum lucidum of thousands of eyes that have forgotten how to blink. They track every movement with a hyper-fixated intensity. These creatures are not zombies or monsters from a movie, they are hyper-evolved versions of the life we once knew, pushed to the brink of madness by a metabolic fire that burns too hot. They are vibrating with a frequency of pure survival, their nerves frayed to the point of constant electrical discharge. For us, the survivors, the exhaustion is a different kind of torture. Humans still need to sleep. Our biology remains tethered to the old world, a world of cycles and recovery. But how do you close your eyes when you know the rats in your walls are chewing through the wood with a frantic, sleepless hunger? How do you dream when the dog at the foot of your bed has been staring at your throat for 72 hours straight, its tail tucked and its body shivering with a need it cannot understand? The psychological weight of being the only thing in the room that needs rest is a burden that is slowly breaking the human spirit. We have become the slow-moving prey in a world of high-velocity killers. The ecological impact is a cascading nightmare. The insects were the first to collapse under the weight of their own activity, followed by the small mammals that feed on them. Because there is no downtime, there is no regrowth. Plants are being stripped of their leaves before they can reach maturity, nests are raided before the eggs can even cool. The speed of life has accelerated to a point where the environment cannot regenerate fast enough to keep up. It is a biological wildfire, burning through the world's resources at 10 times the sustainable rate. We are watching the extinction of silence, and with it, the extinction of the balance that allowed us to exist. Towns that once boasted of their nightlife are now fortresses of steel and reinforced glass. We have learned that light no longer offers protection. In the old days, a campfire might keep the wolves at bay. Now, the light only serves to illuminate the target. The sleepless do not fear the light, they are drawn to anything that moves, anything that represents a potential calorie. They have lost the instinct for caution because their hunger outweighs their fear of death. A starving mountain lion will jump through a glass window not out of malice, but because its brain is screaming for the energy required to keep its heart pumping for another hour of forced consciousness. The soundscape of this new reality is a constant, low-grade hum of activity. The scratching of claws on pavement, the flutter of wings that never fold, the distant, frantic barking of a coyote that has forgotten what home feels like. There is no morning chorus anymore because the song never ended. The days bleed into nights, and the nights are filled with the same frantic energy as the noonday sun. It is a landscape of perpetual motion, a clockwork machine that has had its gears stripped. People have started to experience a form of sensory overload just from the constant background noise of a world that won't turn off. In the laboratories that still function, the data is grim. Scientists call it the hyper-metabolic shift. It is a breakdown of the chemical pathways that regulate adenosine, the molecule that tells a brain it is time to rest. Without it, the brain remains in a state of permanent, jagged alertness. But the brain is not designed for this. The neurons are firing until they burn out, leading to a state of predatory psychosis. These animals aren't just awake, they are in a state of permanent, high-functioning panic. Their bodies are failing them, their organs are under immense stress, but they cannot stop. They are prisoners of their own biology, forced to run until they literally drop dead from exhaustion, an exhaustion that their minds can no longer perceive. The impact on human society is profound. Agriculture has become nearly impossible. How do you protect a field of crops from a swarm of sleepless rabbits that feed day and night? How do you maintain a herd of sheep when the shepherd cannot stay awake as long as the wolves? We are seeing the collapse of the supply chain not because of politics or economics, but because of a fundamental change in the pace of life. We are being outpaced. We are being outrun by a world that has discarded the concept of the day's work. The pressure is constant. The threat is 24/7. There is no longer a safe time to travel or a safe time to repair the walls. In the urban centers, the horror takes on a different shape. The city that never sleeps was once a marketing slogan, now, it is a literal description of a concrete trap. Imagine standing in the middle of a subway station, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, and hearing the sound of thousands of tiny claws skittering through the vents. The rats don't wait for the trains to stop anymore. They don't hide in the dark. They are out in the open, their fur matted with sweat, their bodies twitching with a kinetic energy that makes them move like a blur. They are eating through the wiring of the city, through the insulation, through anything that might contain a trace of organic matter. The apartment buildings have become vertical bunkers. Neighbors who used to nod at each other in the hallway now look through peepholes with eyes rimmed in red. The exhaustion makes us paranoid. When you haven't slept more than 4 hours a night for a month, your brain starts to play tricks. You hear the scratching at the door and you don't know if it's a stray cat or your own mind unraveling. But then you see the scratches on the wood the next morning, deep and frantic, and you realize the truth is worse than the hallucination. The world outside is vibrating with a frequency of pure hunger, and the walls are getting thinner every day. We've had to adapt in ways that feel like a regression to our most primal states. Families sleep in shifts, with at least 2 people always standing guard with high-intensity floodlights and noise deterrents. But even the guards are fraying. Sleep deprivation in humans leads to loss of emotional control and cognitive decline. In a world where the threats are real, paranoia is a survival trait, but it is also a poison. We find ourselves looking at our neighbors, our friends, wondering if they are the next to snap, or if they are hiding the fact that they, too, have stopped feeling the need to sleep. There is a terrifying observation that the mutation may have finally jumped the species barrier. The first signs of a sleepless human are subtle. A slight tremor in the hands. A hyper-focus on small details. A refusal to sit down, even when there is nothing to do. Then comes the hunger, the insatiable craving for protein and fat. If the mutation has truly reached us, then the final thin line between civilization and the tide will vanish. We will become just another part of the frantic, twitching mass of life that is eating the world alive. The prospect of an immortal, sleepless humanity isn't a dream of productivity, it is a nightmare of endless consumption and the total loss of the self. Looking out over the city skyline, the lights are still on, but they feel different now. They aren't signs of life, they are signs of a desperate struggle to keep the dark at bay. But the dark isn't the enemy anymore. The dark was our friend. The dark was when the world took a breath. Now, the world is hyperventilating. Every flickering street lamp reveals a fox darting across the road, a raccoon tearing at a heavy metal door, a swarm of insects thick enough to choke an engine. They are all moving with a speed that is uncomfortable to watch, fluid, twitching, and relentless. There is a psychological toll to seeing the natural order inverted. We grew up with the idea that the world has a cycle, that there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. But when the season is always now and the purpose is always eat, the soul begins to wither. We miss the silence. We miss the way the world felt when it was tucked in, when the wind was the only thing moving through the trees. That world is gone, replaced by a jittery, high-definition version of reality where every detail is sharp, every sound is loud, and every shadow is occupied by a creature that is vibrating with the effort of staying alive. Some have tried to escape to the sea, thinking the water might offer a buffer. But the tide is there, too. The fish are no longer still in the kelp forests. The sharks are patrolling with a frequency that has decimated the reefs. Even the deep-sea creatures, those living in the crushing blackness where light never reaches, have been swept up in the shift. The ocean is a boiling pot of activity, the surface broken by a million fins that never stop moving. There is no corner of this planet that hasn't been touched by the sleepless tide. It is a global synchronization of metabolic madness. We are learning to live in the in-between. We have created zones of artificial quiet, using heavy acoustic foam and sensory deprivation tanks just to give our brains a few hours of the darkness they crave. But even in the silence of a tank, you can feel the vibration of the world outside. You can feel the frantic heartbeat of the planet through the floorboards. It is the sound of a billion hearts racing toward a finish line that doesn't exist. It is the sound of a world that has forgotten how to die, and in doing so, has forgotten how to live. The resource wars have begun, but they aren't about oil or gold. They are about calories. They are about high-density energy bars and emergency rations. Every scrap of food is a precious commodity because the sleepless animals are eating everything before it can be harvested. We are competing with the entire animal kingdom for every mouthful of sustenance. The irony is not lost on us. In our quest for a world that never sleeps, for a 24-hour society, we have finally achieved it. We just didn't realize that the rest of the world would join us, and that they would be much better at it than we are. There is a certain macabre beauty to the way a sleepless predator moves. It is pure, unadulterated intent. There is no hesitation, no wasted motion. It is a machine made of muscle and bone, tuned to a pitch of perfect lethality. But if you look into their eyes, you don't see the animal you once knew. You see a void where the mind used to be, a void filled with the fire of 1,000 suns. They are hollowed out by their own energy. They are ghosts inhabiting bodies that refuse to stop, haunted by a tiredness that they can no longer feel. As the months pass, the physical toll on the landscape becomes irreversible. The forests are thinning, not because of fire or logging, but because the herbivores are eating the bark off the trees in their midnight desperation. The soil is being compacted by the constant movement of hooves and paws. The very earth seems to be wearing thin under the weight of a world that won't sit down. We wonder how long a biological system can sustain this level of output. Biology has limits, even if the mutation has ignored the signals. Eventually, the fuel will run out. The fire will consume everything, and there will be nothing left to burn. We wait for what some call the crash. That is the hope we cling to, the idea that this fever must eventually break. We imagine a day when the millions of red eyes finally dim, when the frantic pacing stops, and when the world collapses into a deep, centuries-long sleep to recover. But what if the crash never comes? What if this is the new baseline? What if the sleepless tide is simply the next stage of life on Earth, a high-speed existence where the slow and the tired are simply filtered out of the gene pool? If that is the case, then humanity is a relic, a slow-moving artifact of a bygone era. For now, we stay behind our walls. We check the locks, we charge the batteries for the lights, and we listen to the scratch of the sleepless at the door. We try to remember what it felt like to wake up refreshed, to feel the world reset itself with the dawn. We tell our children stories of the quiet nights, tales of a time when the stars were the only things watching over us while we slept. They look at us with wide, tired eyes, trying to understand a world where the night was a place of peace rather than a theater of war.